I realized that my last talk on idolatry being the root of dumb conformity and wickedness was lacking some important explanations and examples. So I wanted to give those here. So one question that might arise is, okay, if idolatry is the root of this wicked and stupid conformity, where is the idolatry coming from in the first place, right? And it's always good to try to get to the root of an issue, right? The very bottom root of a source of a problem, right? To hack at the root rather than the branches, as Henry David Thoreau said. So the answer to this is, I think, pretty simple, and it's lack of experience of God, right? Idolatry is rooted in the lack of personal experience of God, right? Because if you had a personal experience of the existence of God, you're unlikely to have idols, right? Because you're going to recognize that they're inferior based on your experience of the true, omnipresent, omniscient, omnipotent, good creator, right? So then this begs the question, okay, well, how do you have such experiences? Well, not through drugs. It's not through ayahuasca or peyote or LSD or any of that. You'll have experiences for sure, and spiritual maybe too, but not of a good sort, as can be recognized by the testimonies of those that are big fans of psychedelics. Like, they don't actually have much to say of substance, right? Just kind of these overarching statements of, oneness or what have you, and they're not being anywhere close to being led to like the crucial teachings of Jesus Christ, right? It's not, I'm not hearing about revelations on the greatest commandments, after people take DMT or whatever. So what is the way to experience God? Well, I'd say actually he's always been there, but it's easy to ignore, right? Because he expresses his presence subtly, right? He's not aggressive. So this is what Christian mysticism talks about, and I've talked about myself. I have a whole playlist talking about particular ways in which I think are avenues of experiencing the divine, particularly through certain forms of guidance we receive and certain forms of grace we receive. So invite you to listen to that playlist if you're interested. I will just say intuition, I think, is actually the Holy Spirit. So you've probably had intuitive experiences that you can recall. Certainly intuition is a common idea or phrase. It's normally not linked to the Holy Spirit, right? It's normally not linked to God. Oftentimes they try to fit it into some evolutionary biology, right? To fit it into some bunk neo-Darwinist worldview. So lack of experience of God, lack of recognition of the presence of God being the root of idolatry. So that's where to start if you find yourself caught up in idolatry. The other thing I wanted to clarify and give some examples on is when I talked about how propaganda comes through means that you wouldn't expect, namely advertising and entertainment. I didn't give any examples, so I want to give a couple, 2 or 3 examples here. So during the whole COVID scenario, you may have noticed that advertising was full of, business advertising, except, everyone's wearing masks, right? Like you're driving down the road and now all of a sudden you just see billboards with everyone wearing masks, right? That's to normalize it, right? To not make you feel like anything's really wrong, right? It's just people taking precaution. It's not medical tyranny. It's not the state claiming ownership of your body by demanding use of a particular medical device. It's just, this is the new normal, and it's permeating all of the advertising to normalize it to your conscious and subconscious mind. Another example in the medical area would be, seeing lots of advertisements with bald children, right? After receiving a certain treatment that can't even be mentioned, right? Because of the censorship of the medical dictatorship that, the combination of state and corporate interests working together to push their own form of totalitarianism and, of course, extreme profit making. But yeah, so you just see in advertising all over the place, and oftentimes it's, put in the context of charity, like, oh, give to this cause, right? But that's not normal, and it's not actually effective, right? And it's extremely horrible as far as the experience goes for children. So it's normalized by continually showing you photos of that, advertising on TV and the internet and billboards and bus ads and so on. So you're just permeated by it, and it's just like, yep, that's just normal now. Which is coupled with just the normalization of kids lots of kids having cancer. Same with autistic children, right? Like, it's just normal now to see them in advertising. It doesn't even have to be an ad having to do with autism. It'll just, show these clearly disabled children. And, it's not a tragedy. It's not a example of, something very wrong being done to society. It's just something to accept as, again, the new normal. Normalization, of course, is also very dominant with meat and dairy, right? Like, fast food images of meat and dairy are just very pervasive, right? It's like definitely one of the most dominant, if not the most dominant form of advertising. You just see images of meat foods, animal flesh foods all the time. Everywhere you go, radio, you're going to hear about it. It's just constantly being pushed, just all the time. How often do you hear about organic vegan foods, organic whole food, vegan products, right? You don't. Another form of propaganda that utilizes advertising is to push certain perspectives on gender roles and just men and women in relationships. So this is in advertising and entertainment, where the man as the leader, protector, and provider is absent, and we have masculinization of women to supposedly empower them, to show them, hey, you can do everything a man can do, as if being feminine is lacking, right? So it's actually anti-femininity, right? It's saying like, oh, if you're not as physically strong as a man, or you don't if you're not a leader, something wrong with you, you're lacking, right? It's inequality, right? Denying the fact that men and women are equal but different, right? Women have superior abilities, namely with nurturing, for example. But this is just pushed constantly through movies and entertainment, TV, and advertising. Like there was a advertisement for men's razors a while back where it showed a couple guys on a sidewalk and like a girl passed by, and the guy just said, like, said something to her, like coming on to her, and the other guy stops him like, oh no, what are you doing? That's not okay, right? Toxic masculinity, right? For a man to approach a woman, right? He wasn't being aggressive. He didn't say anything unkind to her. He was just approaching her, right? As men have done for centuries, and women actually would expect, right, for the man to do that rather than her approach him. So pushing like a cultural Marxist skewed vision on men and women, where again, basically women are masculinized and men are feminized, is very pervasive in both advertising and entertainment, right? Like there's no portrayals of pure masculinity or pure femininity, right? It's all this mix-up or inversion, and that serves a purpose, right? Because it undermines natural harmony between men and women. Main way this is accomplished actually is by encouraging women to be very promiscuous and very early on, and then they quickly, after just a few partners, lose their ability to pair bond, and so then become bored with their relationship. They don't feel a real love connection with whoever they're with, and so they end up being promiscuous even more, right? And dishonest, and it's an epidemic where women are just even taking pride in being cheaters and being sluts, right? Like they even have like slut walks where they're all so proud of their high body counts, as if it's something fantastic and liberating. But then they miss out on actually having a loving relationship and a loving, happy family. So, of course, it's a deception that isn't actually empowering after all, right? If they had stuck with femininity and being loyal to a single man, as women were designed to do, they wouldn't be having the eventual bad outcome, that usually happens in their late 20s, where they, can't find a fulfilling relationship. Most men are no longer interested in them. I mean, I could go on, but these are examples of how propaganda is put through advertising. Another one I wanted to mention is certain slogans that are used. So like currently with these unusual, gigantic, so-called wildfires happening globally, actually, I know here in the States they will keep using the phrase fire season. Oh, it's fire season, and you want to be ready for fire season next year. So they've changed the summer season into fire season, right? Again, to normalize something that isn't normal, right? God didn't create the earth to have these forests that turn into, multi-million acre infernos that then overtake towns, completely decimating wildlife. And on top of that, we have a fraction of the amount of forests that existed on the earth hundreds of years ago, and yet somehow we're having worse and worse fires, right? It clearly makes no sense, but in order to kind of like reassure the population that everything is normal, right? It's just like, oh, this is just fire season. So that's another big example currently occurring. And just repeating the phrase wildfire actually in and of itself is propaganda, right? Because they're not actually wild. This isn't actually just caused by nature, right? It's been caused by the work of humans, right? Clear cutting exposes the forest floor, right? Bakes the forest floor, removes the canopy, and then coupled with leaving underbrush, right? You've then created basically a tinderbox, right? You've maximized the flammability of the forest, which is not the way God designed it, right? So that's why fires are worse than they were even when there was more forests, right? But they'll keep repeating the term wildfire, and they'll keep returning to the term fire season to misdirect you. And this is just inserted into the language of news reports and such in a way that you would not expect is actually having this propagandistic purpose. Another example of how idolatry is pushed through entertainment and advertising and such is by flag placement, right? In movies, TV shows, sports, right? Just being all over the place so that you just constantly seeing it, and they insert it at times of like emotional climax, right? So that you form good associations. And then of course there's just the scripts overall that always, ultimately portray, the government to be the good guys, overall, right? There might be some bad actors, but overall, it's a good institution, right? It's not an extortion racket that, is based on aggression and violation of your right to not be abused. It's a benevolent service provider, right? Speaking of things, you'll never hear, just like I mentioned, you're not going to hear promotion of like organic whole food, vegan options, vegan nutrition, veganic nutrition. You're not going to see promotion or, highlighting of vegan athletes. You're not going to hear regular mention of, making sure you're getting all your vitamins and minerals at adequate levels, which may be higher than the recommended levels. You're not going to be hearing regular reminders that you should be getting parasite cleanses and heavy metal detoxes, right? Because that would undermine the system. It would undermine all this destruction and suffering, actually, right? And that's where we get back to, the spiritual dimension, which is that these systems are fundamentally evil, and what they're perpetrating is evil. How many times have you heard, we need to decentralize and privatize everything? Probably never. How many times have you heard about E100 vehicles? Vehicles that for decades have been built and run to run on 100% ethanol, aka alcohol, which would empower the people to grow their own, produce their own alcohol, through fermentation and distillation, and not be dependent on petrochemical oil industry, right? Right, probably never. You probably never even heard of these vehicles. Or if you have heard about ethanol, you've just only heard terrible things about it. It's just going to destroy your engine, and it's a scam, and right, just all this disinfo to steer you away from something that would actually be empowering. And instead they're replacing all vehicles with these electric, vehicles that increasingly take over autonomy of the driver, and have these kill switches, which enables the government to turn them off at any time, and filled with cameras where you're just being under surveillance the whole time, right? Just horrible. that's normalized, that's pushed, but something like empowering communities to make their own fuel, which you can do from, having a fruit orchard and using the scraps to, again, ferment and produce alcohol, right? It's just unheard of, right? So the media and entertainment and advertising and so on isn't just used to push certain ideas, it's used to gatekeep and keep certain ideas out of the mix, right? That's why, of course, censorship comes into play. And you may not think it is, but once you realize what the key crucial truths are, like the crucial truths and solutions, and then you realize whenever anyone attempts to get those communicated on a mass scale, they fail. Or if it does get any attention, it's just immediately spinned, into something horrible, dangerous, etc. It's immediately hijacked, twisted, bad actors put in play, and, pushed to the side so that you never, hopefully, they're hoping you just never think about it again. How many times do you hear about the industrial hemp industry, right? How many times do you hear about how hemp seed is a complete protein, can produce high quality ethanol, fiber for paper and clothing, fuel, right? It's just not part of the narrative, it's not part of the conversation, right? Because it's not in their interest for that to become commonplace. Instead, they promote, livestock industry, hell on earth for animals, and then producing this food that isn't actually healthy for humans either, but of course all the so-called experts will reassure you that, oh yes, it is. And it's those pushing a vegan diet that they're the propagandists, or they're the deceivers, and just to make sure you don't doubt that, they'll put bad actors out there saying ridiculous things, and have figures pushing twisted versions, like genetically modified foods, literally, twisted down to the genetic level, again, to dissuade you, right? So you never get a clear picture of the good version. You only get a twisted bad version if you hear about it at all, and so it's never considered a viable option to you. And it's across the board crucial truth, whether it's having to do with relations, like what I said about women in particular losing the ability to pair bond after a few partners. If you Google that, or if you ask AI that, it'll say, oh, absolutely not, that's not true, it's the same for men and women, right? But the proof is in reality, right? And you can see it with your own eyes. Women, prior to crossing that boundary, crossing that line, still have an ability to be sweet, feminine, and loving, and loyal to one man, and then it's lost after a few partners. Unlike men, who can still actually bond and love their partner after more partners. So it fits with the masculinization of women and feminization of men. The promiscuity is actually part of that masculinization, to their detriment and the detriment of society as a whole. And that's part of the problem, is that they not only control the propaganda, but then they have their damage control and their misinformation and false actors, controlled opposition and such, that are there to get you back in line in case you do start investigating for yourself. But you just need to investigate sans idols altogether. You need to just trust your own conscience, your own perception, what you observe in your own life. Like you can see what's happening to children when they keep following doctor's orders. The parents keep following the doctor's orders, right? You can see what's happening to the children. You can see what's happening to relationships. You can see what's happening to the environment. You can see what's happening, to just human health overall, right? The world is becoming more and more toxic. People are, becoming more and more sick. And the whole time you're going to be reassured like this is just normal, right? You know, for the autism rates to be skyrocketing, to where it's just normal just to see autistic kids all over the place, and it's normal to see cancer all over the place. It's normal for the elderly to get dementia and Alzheimer's now. That's just, again, the new normal, right? They're just going to reassure you the whole way as they, you know, take you to hell in a handbasket, so to speak.